Deliver me from mine enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from bloody men. For lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me, not for my transgression, nor for my sin, O Lord. They run and prepare themselves without my fault. Awake to help me, and behold. Thou therefore, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to visit all the heathen. Be not merciful to any wicked transgressors. Selah.
Early summer 2012, Representatives Bachmann and Gohmert, along with 3 other members of Congress, penned letters to the Inspectors General of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Department of State outlining their serious national security concerns. Namely, the deep penetration of the U.S. government by Muslim Brotherhood operatives. They requested formal investigations into influence operations. Without further delay, please allow me to introduce my friend and colleague, Philip Haney, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm sure we all recognize we're at a turning point in history. Would we all agree with that? Yes. There's a reason why I'm here today, and that is my oath of office. And so as a reminder, I would like to read the very same oath of office that any of us who were or are active duty in either the military or in law enforcement took. And so I'm going to recite it as I did in the day that I became a CBP officer in March of 2003. I, Philip B. Haney, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear the truth, the faith and allegiance of the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office to which I am about to enter, so help me God. And that's exactly what I did. In the course of that career with the Department of Homeland Security, excuse me, I happened to witness firsthand some of the most amazing events that have happened in our country's history since 9/11. Jeff mentioned that I had a background in the Middle East, that I was a scientist. I was an entomologist. I was a real original nerd. And what do nerds do? They collect everything, right? And they write everything down. That's a potent combination when you take a nerd and you turn him into a counterterrorism specialist, especially if he's an entomologist, because what do entomologists do? Especially me, I follow the trail and I find the nest. That is counterterrorism. Follow the trail, find the nest. And I'm going to walk you today through the case that I worked on regarding the Fort Pierce Mosque that's involved in the Orlando shooting, and I'm going to show you exactly how to connect the dots. And you're going to see that some of the explanations for what happened are well below minimally adequate in terms of the level of responsibility, and some of it reaches abrogation of duty in terms of our elected officials. And if you might be tempted to think that that's a bold statement, then I'm going to walk you right through the whole process, and you'll see you can come to your own conclusions about whether you agree with my premise or not. So to back up, I'm going to go through a little bit of history. In 2003, as I already mentioned, I was a founding member of the Department of Homeland Security. I was literally there from the very first day. I was already in federal service in what is called plant protection and quarantine. It's a small little tiny subgroup of the United States Department of Agriculture. But when DHS was formed in March of 2003, they pulled about 1,200 individuals into this new agency called DHS from agriculture, and I was one of them. But even before that, I made an attempt to join up because Max Cleland, our senator from Georgia, handwrote a letter to Tom Ridge inviting him to hire me in the new, what was called at the time, Office of Homeland Security. It was still in the White House. It didn't happen that way. I came into DHS another direction. But not very long after I became a founding member of Department of Homeland Security, I began to do what we call intelligence analysis. I was writing commentary on statements by Osama bin Laden, for example, and even as early as then I was talking about CARE. Well, I sent these memos up the chain of command, and eventually I got the attention of the higher-ups, and they sat me down and they said, "Mr. Haney, what are we going to do with you? You're not really just an agriculture officer, but you're not an armed officer either." So they had created a new branch of intelligence group, and they put me on that. And then they found out I took shorthand. So what do you suppose happened then? I became the note taker. So that was 2003. Then my first encounter, and this is where I come in contact with William Ferry, was an article that I wrote, which is still on the World Wide Web. You can go look it up today, called Green Tide Rising, Hamas Ascends. It was a before, now, and after, past, present, future, three-part analysis of what we could expect from Hamas there in the Gaza Strip. If you were to go back and look it up now, you would find that it seems like it might have been written 5 minutes ago, not 10 years ago. But somehow the CIA contractors that I was attending a class with decided that I could not have written an article like that unless I had unethically accessed classified information. They never asked me, how did I come to these conclusions? They just assumed, apparently, that I had breached protocol, and they turned me into headquarters. And that's how I met Bill Ferry. He was the collateral duty officer from Newark, New Jersey, who came down to investigate me. He interviewed everybody in my horizontal chain and everybody in my vertical chain of command. After 11 months, I was exonerated. To this day, and he may shed some light, there are factors and reasons in that investigation that still mystify me, because you must keep in mind that Hamas, at that point, was already a globally designated terrorist organization. So why would personnel from the Department of Homeland Security, founded to help protect our country from terrorism, investigate one of its own officers for writing about terrorism? 2008, November, is a turning point in the history of American counterterrorism efforts. It's called the Holy Land Foundation trial. November 2008. Keep that date in your mind, because every single thing that I talk about, actually all of us talk about today, that took place after November of 2008, by default, is a deliberate and intentional abrogation of minimal constitutionally mandated duty. Because why? It was proven in federal court that organizations, front groups from the Muslim Brotherhood Network in the United States, and specifically talking about Council on American Islamic Relations, called CARE, which has offices right here in Washington, the Islamic Society of North America, called ISNA, and the North American Islamic Trust, which is what is called in Arabic a waqf. It's a holding company that owns most of the mosques in the United States, NAIT. The original plan was to prosecute or at least take to court in phase 2 of the Holy Land trial. It never happened. But what did happen was that 5 individuals were indicted and found guilty on 102 charges of raising somewhere between $12 and $60 million for support of Hamas. It was irrefutably proven in federal court by the Department of Justice that CARE, ISNA, and NAIT had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and explicitly to Hamas. That has not changed from then to now, and every single one of those organizations are still functioning. In fact, not only are they merely functioning, but the leaders of those organizations were deliberately and intentionally brought into the administration to help promote and create both domestic and foreign policy. And this status continues to this very day. And that is one of the reasons why I ended up in such an overtly adversarial relationship with my own government and my own agency, because I had the audacity to have targeted those individuals and those organizations and put that information into the law enforcement system. That brought the U.S. government to a crisis. And that crisis is what? What are we going to do with the law enforcement information that's in the system? We call it derogatory information if we're trying to bring the leaders of these groups into a relationship with the government. You have two choices. Act on it from a law enforcement perspective and carry forward, or ignore it. But even ignoring it is simply a passive response. They didn't stop there. They became deliberate and intentional. And in 2009, what I call the first Great Purge, they ordered me to remove the linking information from all 850 records that I'd put into the system. Right exactly at the time when I was watching the C-SPAN hearings with the committees in Congress and expressing their concerns about the underwear bomber. And their two concerns were that failure to connect the dots and the radicalization of U.S. citizens and or lawful permanent residents. Exactly what we saw in Orlando and in San Bernardino and in Chattanooga and in Fort Hood and in Boston. The very same thing that the Congress expressed so clearly they were concerned about is exactly what happened. Radicalization of U.S. citizens and or lawful permanent residents. We call them green card holders. That was the first Great Purge in 2009. They ordered me to modify, that was the word, it's a euphemism. And how many people here have been pulled over by a state trooper? He walks up to you and he says, I'm going to give you a ticket. But I'm not going to tell you why. I just pulled you over and I'm going to give you a ticket. You got to pay the fine. It's $100. But I'm not going to tell you why. That's not acceptable, is it? Well, in my case, when I put those records into the system, but there was no explanatory reason for why those records were in the system, my colleagues have no reason or no understanding of why I put the records in there in the first place. So they're going blind. Comes 2/11, what we call the second Great Purge. This is when you start to hear in the news people like Stephen Coughlin and Matthew Dooley and John Guandolo and Bill Gothrop, one or two special subject matter experts from each one of the major federal government law enforcement oriented agencies. They came after us first. They started from a top-down approach. They knocked off all the subject matter experts in each one of the agencies, and then they went forward with the next steps of their program, which eventually morphed into what we call Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE, also known in foreign contexts as engagement and dialogue. They made the choice that rather than base counterterrorism on a fact-based law enforcement approach, they were going to begin a subjective approach based on engagement, discussions, community actions, etc., etc. And as we will show you in a minute, it has metastasized into a full-blown policy that was just published publicly, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. We come to 2012, right in the time of the Great Purge. FBI publishes a document called Guiding Principles, Touchstone Document on Training. It's available online. There's 3 sections to it. It's a 3-page document, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, and I'll slightly paraphrase, says, even though an individual is affiliated with a known terrorist organization, you cannot assume that that individual is a terrorist himself. Now, you think that approach may have had some bearing on why the FBI announced that they opened a case on Mateen twice and had to close it because they couldn't find anything? Maybe that touchstone document had an influence on their approach vis-a-vis law enforcement. I'd say that the plausibility is very high. Then we come to things when they begin to really intensify. And that is in the year 2012 when I was working at the National Targeting Center, not far from here in Reston, on a case called the Tablighi Jamaat Initiative. Tablighi Jamaat is a group, a Salafi Sunni organization with between 75 and 125 million members worldwide. They are called the Party of the Promoters. They came here to the United States in groups of 3, 4, and 5, and they were abusing the visa waiver system. That's how we first noticed them. William Ferry and I broke one of the major early cases, and I suspect perhaps, though I don't know for sure, I don't think it's ever happened in the history of the Department of Homeland Security when the subject of an investigation ended up breaking a major case with the investigator. But that's exactly what happened. 4.5 years later, after he investigated me in the fall of 2006, and he'll explain more, we ended up working on a major case that became what I went to NTC for a couple years after that. And this also is when the State Department, you okay on time? Okay, should I go faster? No. We good? State Department came to the National Targeting Center, a group of 7 and 3 SESs, and had a meeting in upstairs and said they had concerns about our focus on Tablighi Jamaat because it was not a designated terrorist organization. Therefore, in plain language, they said, you're violating their civil rights and civil liberties. Now, I remember I told you I took shorthand? Well, I was the proverbial fly or ant on the wall. I wrote down everything they said. I never said a word the entire meeting, but I wrote down everything that they said. It wasn't recorded, except I recorded it. So I heard it firsthand, and then it was verified later on when Judicial Watch, thank God for them, FOIA'd my own case, because I was eventually investigated by 3 different branches of the federal government all at the same time, and one of them was the Inspector General, Department of Homeland Security. When I asked for the results of my own case, they told me point blank, you can't have it. You have to FOIA it. So Judicial Watch stepped up and they FOIA'd it for me. And we found, snuggled in some of the caches of documents, the emails going back and forth that told exactly why they shut down the Tablighi Jamaat case. They were going to take it in another direction, another euphemism, because of concerns over civil rights and civil liberties. Subsequently, I went back home to my home port and I created a component of the Tablighi Jamaat case called the Institute of Islamic Education. And if any of you have heard me speak in the public about the 67 deleted records, that's where that case came from. They went into the system. This time there was no euphemism. They just flat out deleted the entire case, all 67 records, with all the biometrics. That means passports, birth dates, parents, families, addresses, travel patterns, everything obliterated. And that was bad enough until December 2nd of 2015. What happened then? San Bernardino. And I was watching the news, as we all did, and all of a sudden a piece of information came across the screen. I was sitting in my little office and I sat up and yelled at the screen, "That's my case!" Because it was the Tablighi Jamaat. I knew it like that. And all of a sudden, everything started happening in my head because, holy smokes, Batman, they deleted the records that tied directly to that case. What would have happened if we would have been allowed to continue forward working on that case? 2 plausible possibilities. Syed Farouk, the male who was the shooter, would have been denied permission to fly because he would have been associated with the derogatory organization. Number 2, his pending fiancée, Tashfeen Malik, would have been denied a visa and she never would have come into the country. Meanwhile, we found out subsequently there's a third way it would have been stopped. The man who provided the guns to Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik is in jail now. For what? Multiple failed plots with Syed Farouk. Hold on. Slow down. That's a plural. Obviously, they happened before he was killed. That means they knew. No one intervened. Just like Orlando. It gets better. or worse. Okay, the news breaks about the shooting in Orlando a couple days ago. My colleague and I, Art, we have an RV. We're on a book tour. We're sitting in the RV, and I decided I'm going to go step by step through an investigation and connect the dots on this case, just like I used to when I was active duty, except for one caveat. I don't have classified information anymore. So I'm going to do this thing open source. So in order for me to verify or drive a stake into the ground for the beginning of the case, the first thing that I had to do was irrefutably verify that Omar Mir Siddiqui Mateen was in fact affiliated with the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce. We heard bits and pieces of it. So I gathered up all the open source information I could find, I laid it on the table, and I went after it. And I queried and I queried, and I finally found an article in the Palm Beach Post, local paper, quoting the Imam, whose name is Shafiqur Rahman, that yes, indeed, Omar Mir Siddiqui Mateen was a member of this mosque. Now I have the stake in the ground. It's a solid, probable cause level piece of law enforcement information that you can build a case on top of, and it'll stand forever because it's on solid fact. So then what do you suppose I did? I went to the website of the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce. And lo and behold, what do I find right on their website? That they're directly affiliated with the Sharia Board of America. Well, right off there, there's a big, bright, blinking red light, because the word Sharia should be an immediate warning. Sharia law is illegal in the United States because it's in direct conflict with the U.S. Constitution. And yet we constantly hear from apologists and spokesmen that they have no intention of implementing Sharia law in the United States. Well, if that's the case, then why is the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce directly linked to a group called Sharia Board of America? Well, I can tell you why. Because their goal is to implement Sharia law in the United States. Next, I go to its founding or its parent organization called Rahmat-i-Alam Foundation. Rahmat-i-Alam means mercy to the world. I'm already in the Tablighi Jamaat case, and I know it because it's all up here in the old noodle. I can remember everything about the cases that I do. I'm starting to realize right now that this is going to be the second case that's tied directly, along with San Bernardino, to the case that the federal government shut down because of concerns about civil rights and civil liberties. So I go from Rahmat al-Alam clear up to Dar Uloom, Chicago. Does anybody remember the mosque's name in San Bernardino? Dar Uloom al-Islamiyah. Now I have a direct connection. There's the network. The thing in Orlando is like a radioactive spill from a nuclear power plant. It's part of a network that's spread across the entire United States. And this is one of the points I want to try to make. Every time we see an act of terrorism in the United States, the finger eventually always goes to ISIS. This network is not even Arabic. This is Indian subcontinent in origin. It's an entirely different branch, if you will, of a big tree. The notion that everything originates from ISIS is a false notion, and it will lull us into a sense of complacency that will get us hurt over and over and over again. There are more than one networks operating at the same time in the United States. Then from Dar Uloom, Chicago, I go right up to the Institute of Islamic Education. This is the case that I worked on with the 67 direct deleted records. And from there, one more step, and we're into the Tablighi Jamaat initiative. Now I have a direct, no-gap link all the way from the mosque in Fort Pierce all the way up to the case that I garnered 1,200 law enforcement actions from in 11 months, 100 a month, which is like 25 a week. Plus, I was given, as you will see in the book if you have looked at it, credit for finding 300 terrorists while I was working at the NTC on a TDY. How many terrorists were involved in this shooting in Orlando? One. How many in San Bernardino? 2, maybe 3, depending on how you want to count it. How about Fort Hood? 1. How about Chattanooga? 1. How about Boston bombing? A couple, 2 or 3 maybe. Still waiting to see about that. How many did I get credit for? 300. That's right. So I broke this on Breitbart a couple days ago, and now things are blowing up. I don't criticize my law enforcement colleagues, but when Director Comey said that we had done all we had, my immediate question was, did you talk to CBP? When you conducted your investigations on the ground of Mateen, did you share any of the information with CBP so that they would know if he traveled and he was coming back and forth, they can collect more data for you? Or on the other hand, did CBP ever know that he was being investigated by the FBI? Probably not. And the reason why is because we don't have reciprocity. We can't share information directly. It has to go through a liaison called the Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF liaison. And that's the state of things where we are. But there's one more point. Does anybody recall what Mateen's father said about his son when the news started breaking? Just to paraphrase. Well, guess what we found out this morning? Senior Mateen is the vice president of the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce. Which tells you now, and it proves my point all along, that this is a network of organizations. There's no such thing as a random act of violence any more than there is a random ant of violence, because ants live in colonies. And if you take an ant away from its fellow ants and put him in a little jar, he'll die within hours. As soon as you separate the ant from the colony, he just turns into a raisin and dies. He has to be within the environment. Same with the Islamic world. And let me finish up with the real nature of the threat. It's not jihad. It's Sharia. The reason we see jihad is a tactic. Sharia law is the strategy. And we're fighting tactics when we don't understand the strategy, and we're doomed to fail every time. Because in shooting, those of you who shoot know you have to acquire the target and stay aimed in. What if the target is moving? And you insist on firing at where the target was? You'll never hit anything. But what if you know where your target's going to end up in 10 minutes from now, over there in that corner? You wait. That's the difference between strategy and tactics. We will not be successful in defending our liberties and values till we comprehend the true nature of the gravitational force of Sharia law vis-a-vis the U.S. Constitution. It's not about our neighbors, it's not about prayer, it's not about freedom of religion, it's about Sharia law versus the Constitution. We need to shift the narrative, take the remote away and say we're not going to watch that channel anymore, we're going to watch this channel. This is the U.S. Constitution channel right there. It's staying on that, period. And if we evaluate everything on that basis, including the upcoming elections, ask yourself who is more likely to stand up for the values of the U.S. Constitution. That's the basis that you should use in evaluating not only presidential candidates, but every other part of our society too. We need to have a secular revival and go back to the U.S. Constitution. As in a matter of fact, we need to have a spiritual revival to upgrade our own integrity. Because it's absolutely impossible that if I had taken that vow and I didn't have personal integrity after being investigated 9 times, what do you think would have happened to me? I would have been dead meat a long time ago. So thank you all for listening.